Have you ever heard whispers on the wind when you're all alone? Or felt the unnerving sensation that the trees themselves are watching you? Tonight, we journey into the heart of such a place whispered about in hushed tones by those who live on its edge. This is the story of Blackwood Forest, and the three friends who dared to spend a night within its shifting shadows. Our story begins with Sabrina, a thrill-seeker at heart, and her two best friends, Eli and Marcus. They were inseparable, always looking for their next big adventure. When Sabrina suggested a camping trip to the infamous Blackwood Forest, Eli was hesitant, while Marcus, ever the skeptic, just laughed it off. The locals had stories, of course, they always do. They spoke of a forest that was more than just trees and soil. They sighed it was alive. They warned the trio that after the sun dipped below the horizon, Blackwood Forest changed. Trails that were clear by day would vanish. Trees would whisper your name on the breeze, and some who entered after dark simply never returned. For Sabrina, these warnings were like gasoline on the fire of her curiosity. For Eli, they were a cold knot of dread in his stomach. For Marcus, they were just old wives' tales, ghost stories meant to scare children. So, with backpacks full of gear and hearts full of mixed emotions, they drove towards the edge of the sprawling, ancient woods. The moment they stepped out of the car, the air felt different. It was heavy, thick, with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and watchful. They found a small clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp, or so they thought. As they hammered in the tent stakes and gathered firewood, the forest seemed to hold its breath around them. The usual chirping of birds and buzzing of insects was strangely absent. There was only a profound, almost deafening, silence. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange through the canopy, they got the campfire roaring. Its warm, golden light pushed back the encroaching darkness, creating a small bubble of safety in the vast, quiet woods. They told stories, roasted marshmallows, and tried to ignore the growing unease. But the forest wouldn't let them. The campfire, their only shield against the gloom, began to act strangely. It would flare up brightly for a moment, then shrink down to mere embers, flickering and sputtering as if a great unseen lung were breathing on it. A cold draft would snake through the clearing, even when the air was perfectly still. Eli swore he could hear faint breathing carried on that wind, a rhythmic, guttural sound that was definitely not human. Marcus, trying to keep everyone's spirits up, just blamed it on the wind and odd acoustics. But even he kept glancing nervously into the impenetrable wall of trees that surrounded them. As the night deepened, the strangeness escalated. They would hear a twig snap just beyond the firelight, but when they shined their flashlights, there was nothing. A shadow would seem to dart between the trees, too quick to be real. Sabrina, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, tried to rationalize it. It's just our minds playing tricks on us, she told herself, and the others. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, a persistent pressure at the back of her neck. Exhausted from the tension, they eventually retreated to their tent, zipping it up tight against the night. They tried to sleep, but every rustle of leaves, every hoot of a distant owl, sounded magnified and menacing. Eli was practically vibrating with anxiety, while Marcus had fallen into a restless, fitful sleep. Sabrina lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, her ears straining to decipher the sounds of the night. And then it happened. At precisely 1:13 a.m. She knew because she had just checked her phone's glowing screen. She heard it. It was a whisper, soft and clear, cutting through the silence of the forest. Sabrina. It was her name. It wasn't Eli, and it wasn't Marcus. The voice was coming from outside the tent, from deep within the woods. It sounded both inviting and utterly terrifying. Her blood ran cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She sat bolt upright, her breath catching in her throat. Eli, wake up, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. Eli jolted awake, his eyes wide with fear. Did you hear that? Sabrina asked, her voice trembling. He just nodded, unable to speak. Together, they turned to wake Marcus. But his side of the tent was empty. His sleeping bag was still there, slightly rumpled, but Marcus was gone. Panic set in. They called his name, first in whispers, then in frantic shouts, that the silent forest seemed to swallow whole. There was no reply. Unzipping the tent, they scrambled out into the cold night air. The campfire had died down to a bed of glowing, red embers. And there, at the very edge of the clearing, was Marcus's flashlight. It was still on, its powerful beam cutting a sharp, white line into the darkness. But it wasn't just lying on the ground. It was pointing directly at a narrow, gnarled path that snaked away into the trees. A path that Sabrina was certain hadn't been there when they first arrived. What else could they do? They had to find their friend. With Sabrina gripping a small pocket knife and Eli holding his own flashlight with a trembling hand, they stepped onto the unfamiliar trail, leaving the relative safety of their campsite behind. The moment they passed the first line of trees, the world changed. The already faint signal on their phones vanished completely. The air grew colder, and the silence became absolute. It was a physical presence, pressing in on them, muffling their footsteps and their ragged breaths. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the forest's core. The trees here were older, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the moonless sky. Every step felt like they were walking into a trap. And then, the whispering started again. It wasn't just one voice this time. It was many, faint, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from the leaves, the bark, the very air around them. At first, they were just indistinct murmurs, but as they walked on, the words became clearer. "You shouldn't have come here." A voice hissed from their left. "Get out." Another seemed to sigh from their right. "Lost. You are lost." The voices were everywhere, a chorus of ghostly warnings and taunts. They weren't just hearing them, they could feel them, vibrating through the soles of their feet, raising the hairs on their arms. Eli was openly weeping now, begging Sabrina to turn back. But Sabrina, fueled by a terrifying mix of fear and determination, pushed forward. She had to find Marcus. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in until their branches snagged at their clothes like grasping hands. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the voices swirling around them in a dizzying cacophony. And then, the path simply ended. It opened into another small, unnatural clearing. In the center, there was no sign of Marcus. There was only a single, ancient oak tree, far larger than any they had seen before. Its bark was twisted into patterns that looked disturbingly like screaming faces. And carved into its trunk, freshly cut as if by a knife, were 3 words: "You are next." Terror, pure and undiluted, finally broke through Sabrina's resolve. She grabbed Eli's arm and they turned and ran. They didn't look for the path. They just plunged into the undergrowth, crashing through bushes and stumbling over roots, the whispers chasing them, laughing at their fear. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead, until they burst out of the tree line and collapsed onto the familiar dirt road where they had parked their car. They didn't look back. They jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away, leaving Blackwood Forest and their friend behind. Marcus was never seen again. The police searched for weeks, but found no trace of him. No footprints, nothing beyond the abandoned campsite. The narrow path Sabrina and Eli followed was gone, as if it had never existed. The locals just shook their heads. Another tragic story to add to the legend of the living forest. Sabrina and Eli never spoke of what truly happened that night at 1:13 a.m., but they would never forget the whispers, or the cold, terrifying certainty that the forest had taken their friend, and that it was hungry for more. So if you ever find yourself near woods that feel a little too quiet, a little too watchful, maybe listen to the local legends. Maybe, just maybe, don't stay after sunset. For Sabrina and Eli, what waited in the deep, quiet heart of the forest was a secret that should have stayed buried. They'd been hiking all day, chasing the fading sunlight through a maze of ancient trees. The air grew colder, the path less certain, and a sense of unease settled over them like a damp fog. That's when they saw it. Tucked away in a small clearing, almost swallowed by the encroaching wilderness, stood an old wooden cabin. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, forgotten. Moss, thick and green, like a velvet shroud, clung to the window panes, obscuring whatever lay inside. The door was ajar, hanging crooked on a single rusty hinge, and dark, open invitation into the unknown. It looked like it was waiting for them. Against their better judgment, driven by a morbid curiosity they couldn't explain, they pushed the door open. The groan of the wood was a low, mournful sound that echoed in the sudden stillness. The air that rushed out to greet them was heavy and cloying, a mixture of damp, overturned earth and the unmistakable, sweet sick scent of decay. It was a smell that clawed at the back of their throats. The inside was a single, dusty room, frozen in time. A layer of grime covered everything: a small table, 2 rickety chairs, a fireplace choked with ash, but it was the walls that drew their attention. Tacked up with rusty nails were photographs, dozens of them faded and curled at the edges. Sabrina moved closer, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Her breath hitched. The photos, they were of her and Eli. They were impossible pictures. There they were, gathering firewood just a few hours ago. Another showed them laughing by the stream they'd crossed at midday. And there, a picture of them standing at the makeshift campfire they had just left. The flames dancing in the twilight. It felt like their entire day had been documented by an unseen observer. Eli grabbed her arm, his knuckles white. "Sabrina, how is this possible?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Sabrina's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved the flashlight along the row of photos, her dread growing with each frame. Then she saw the last one. It was the same picture of them at the campfire. But this time they weren't alone. Standing just behind them, in the deep shadows between the trees, was Marcus, their friend Marcus, who had cancelled on the trip at the last minute. But it wasn't him. Not really. His eyes were 2 soulless black pits, and his mouth was stretched open in an unnaturally wide, silent scream. Slam! The sound was deafening, a violent crack that splintered the silence. They spun around. The cabin door, the one that had been hanging limply on its hinge, was now shut tight. Sealed. Panic flared in Sabrina's chest as Eli threw his shoulder against the heavy wood. It didn't budge. It was as if the forest itself was holding it closed. And then the whispers started. They weren't in any language they could understand, just sibilant, overlapping hisses that seemed to come from the very walls around them. They slithered through the air, curling around their ears, murmuring forgotten names and ancient sorrows. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on them from all sides. The temperature in the room plummeted. Sabrina's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for any explanation. Her gaze fell upon a grimy, tarnished mirror hanging on the far wall. The glass was so dark it barely reflected their frantic shapes. But as she stared, something else moved within its depths. Not a reflection. It was a shadow, tall and impossibly thin, detaching itself from the darker corners of the mirror's world. It didn't walk. It crawled, its limbs bending at sickening angles as it slithered across the floor of the reflection, moving directly toward the image of Eli. A scream tore from Sabrina's throat, raw and full of terror. "Eli, behind you." She pointed a shaking finger at the empty space where the shadow in the mirror was. Eli spun around, his face a mask of confusion. There was nothing there, but when Sabrina turned back to warn him again, to show him what she saw, he was gone. The space where he had stood was empty. The whispers intensified, laughing now. She was alone. The cabin, which had felt menacing before, now felt actively malevolent. It was alive. Dark, sticky sap, thick and black as tar, began to bleed from the wooden walls, running in rivulets down to the floor. The air grew thick with the resinous, sickly sweet smell. Below her feet, the floorboards began to groan and warp, the gaps between them widening, splitting open like a grotesque, splintered mouth, preparing to swallow her whole. Pure, instinctual terror took over. Sabrina scrambled for the door, not caring if it was sealed, beating her fists against the unyielding wood. She screamed Eli's name until her voice was raw. With one last desperate shove, the door flew open, not with a creak, but with a sigh of released pressure. She stumbled out into the clearing, gasping for the clean night air, turning back to face the monstrous cabin. But there was nothing there. The clearing was empty. The cabin, the moss-covered windows, the half-open door, was all gone. In its place stood a circle of gnarled, ancient trees, their branches twisted together as if they had stood there for 1,000 years. It was as if the cabin had never existed at all. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind? Then, a sound drifted on the wind, faint and distant, but horribly clear. It was Eli's voice, echoing from the deep, dark woods all around her. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a calm, ethereal whisper. "Sabrina, stay with us." The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once. A siren's call from the heart of the forest that had already claimed him. She was alone, lost, and the woods were whispering her name. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. It's a beautiful sight, but for three friends hiking in Blackwood Forest, it's a death sentence. The night doesn't just bring darkness here, it awakens something ancient, something hungry. This is the story of what happened to Sabrina, Eli, and Marcus. Their day started like any other adventure. Laughter, a packed lunch, and the promise of stunning views. But as the trails twisted and turned, they realized they were lost. Not just a little off track, but profoundly, terrifyingly lost. The familiar chirping of birds had been replaced by an unnerving silence, the kind that presses in on you, heavy and suffocating. Panic began to set in, a cold knot tightening in their stomachs. Eli, ever the leader, tried to keep everyone calm. "We just need to retrace our steps," he'd said, his voice a little too loud in the dead air. Marcus, always the skeptic, just scoffed, "Great plan. Which steps?" That's when things took a turn for the truly bizarre. As they argued, a deer stumbled out of the thicket. But it wasn't a normal deer. Its eyes were wide with a primal terror, and a strange, dark liquid dripped from its mouth. It took one look at them, let out a sound that was half scream, half bleat, and bolted, crashing through the undergrowth as if fleeing the devil himself. The three friends stood frozen, the unnatural silence rushing back in to fill the space the deer had left. The woods were no longer just woods. They were a place of wrongness. The air grew colder, and they could feel it a presence. They weren't alone. As dusk settled, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, clinging to the ground like a shroud. It swallowed the trees, the trail, everything. They were trapped in a grey, featureless world. That's when the whispers started. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew clearer, slithering into their ears. Their own names, spoken by voices that were almost familiar but distorted, twisted into something menacing. Sabrina, ... Eli, ... Marcus, ... The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, playing on their fears, amplifying their doubts. Eli tried to dismiss it as the wind, but Sabrina knew better. She felt the forest watching them, its ancient intelligence focusing on their growing terror. In a desperate bid for survival, they decided to split up, a classic mistake straight out of a horror movie. Eli and Marcus would search for the main trail, while Sabrina would stay put and build a fire. Before they left, Sabrina grabbed a knife. "I'll mark the trees," she said, her voice trembling, "so you can find your way back to me." She carved a large X into the trunk of a massive oak. A moment later, a searing pain shot up her arm. She cried out, dropping the knife. There, on her own skin, was a freshly carved X, bleeding, a perfect mirror of the mark on the tree. Terror, pure and absolute, seized her. She tried again, a small, hesitant line on another tree. Instantly, another matching cut appeared on her other arm. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. The forest wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was sentient, and it was marking her, claiming her as its own. The whispers grew louder, no longer just names, but taunts. "You're one of us now," they hissed. "You can't leave." Every tree she saw seemed to have a face in its bark. Every shadow seemed to move. She was a prisoner in a living, breathing jail made of wood and leaves. Meanwhile, Eli and Marcus were having their own nightmare. The fog was so thick they could barely see their own hands. The trail they thought they were following seemed to loop back on itself, the same gnarled tree appearing over and over again, no matter which direction they walked. The whispers followed them, too, but they were different. They mimicked Sabrina's voice, crying for help, leading them deeper and deeper into the woods. "Ilu, Marcus, I'm over here. Hurry." Marcus, frantic, would chase after the sound, only to find nothing but more fog and more trees. Eli, more rational, tried to stop him, realizing it was a trap. Their friendship, already frayed by fear, began to tear apart. Back at the camp, Sabrina was losing her grip. The pain from the cuts on her arms was a constant, throbbing reminder of her situation. She was a part of the forest, and the forest wanted her to stay forever. She could feel its consciousness pressing in on her, a vast, ancient mind filled with a loneliness that was terrifying. It didn't want to hurt her, it just wanted company. It wanted her to become a permanent part of its collection. She huddled by the weak, sputtering fire, whispering to herself, rocking back and forth. The forest was talking to her, telling her its secrets, showing her images of others who had been chosen, their faces fading into the bark of the trees. The last time Sabrina saw her friends, it was just a glimpse through the swirling fog. They were arguing, their faces pale and drawn. Marcus was shouting, pointing a finger at Eli. Eli was trying to reason with him, but the fear had made them strangers to each other. Then, a shadow detached itself from a tree behind them. It was tall, impossibly tall, and featureless, a column of pure darkness. It didn't have a face, but Sabrina could feel it looking at them. It glided towards them, silent and inevitable. Marcus turned his scream cut short. Eli tried to run, and then, they were gone, swallowed by the fog and the faceless thing that lived within it. When dawn finally broke, the fog receded, and the forest looked normal again. The birds began to sing. A rescue team, alerted by their abandoned car, found Sabrina sitting in the middle of the trail. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, staring at nothing. Her arms were covered in dozens of cuts, forming a strange, map-like pattern. She was whispering, but not to them. She was talking to the trees. They asked her about Eli and Marcus. She just smiled a serene, unsettling smile and said, "They're home now. They're part of the family." They never found any trace of the two men. Weeks later, another group of hikers, far more fortunate, ventured deep into Blackwood. They stumbled upon something, not on any map, a small, rustic wooden cabin that looked like it had been there for a century. Curious, they peeked inside. The air was musty and old. On a dusty wall hung 3 framed photographs. They recognized the faces from the news: Sabrina, Eli, and Marcus. They were all smiling, looking happy and at peace. But as one of the hikers looked closer at the photo, their blood ran cold. In the background, standing in the deep shadows behind the smiling trio, was a 4th figure. It was tall, black, and had no face. The forest doesn't let everyone go. The forest keeps who it chooses. Thank you so much for joining me on this terrifying journey into Blackwood. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay safe out there, and maybe think twice before your next hike.